cool. And you mentioned I like the disturbance and rest. I think that's a really good. I've never really heard it phrased that way, so I like that philosophy, and that makes me lead into the next topic I want to dive into, which is we have a war on cows right now. We have this mainstream idea, kind of like the fact that only conventional farming can feed the world. There's this idea swirling around that cows are the worst thing that's happened to this planet ever. But from my research, I think that's pretty far from the truth. And of course, grown in a conventional way, when we're putting them in CAFOs, basically putting them in prisons, and we have all this waste coming into sewage piles. Like, yeah, that's not the best for it. But how can we actually utilize cows to help sequester carbon in the soil and actually utilize cows as a means for improving the soil and improving the overall health of the planet?
Sure. What a what a fantastic question, and it's one that anyone who cares is struggling with, and I recognize that because overgrazing and livestock, um, well, agriculture in general. If you study the history of civilizations, generally, agriculture has not been good for the planet. Now let's just say, and so I get that, and I understand the burden that caring people carry over, man, can't we eat without destroying things? I mean, that basic question is just it's such an important question. So um, so how how did we get rich soils? These virgin soils that were here. How did they arrive? And they arrived through this disturbance and rest cycle with perennials and perennials as opposed to annuals. So just to make sure we don't lose anybody here, a perennial is a plant that you don't have to plant every year. It stays alive year after year. An annual is a plant that you have to plant a seed every year in order for that plant to grow. So all of our major farm crops, corn, oats, wheat, barley, cotton, sugarcane, all of our crops are annuals. The perennials are, I mean, there's a few vegetables that are perennials, like asparagus and rhubarb. Those are perennials, but squash and watermelon and green beans, those are all annuals. But the prairie grasses, and originally there were 40 varieties of plants in every acre of prairie. That's how diversified they were, and those plants were primarily perennials. Grass, your lawn. Okay, you don't have to plant it every year. Those are perennials. And so the way nature, the way herbivores were designed to work is that these perennials, they have a real fast growth cycle. Unlike a tree, they grow fast and then they turn brown. They go through their life cycle. And so these plants grow in an S curve, a sigmoid curve. They start slow, then they speed up, and then they slow down, and that sine curve. And I call the first part, I call it diaper grass. The second part is teenage grass, and the third part is nursing home grass. Okay, so the reason that the planet has so many herbivores, bison, wildebeest, giraffes, elephants, deer, elk, caribou. The reason guinea pigs. Okay, the reason the plant has so many herbivores is in order to, as these plants begin approaching senescence, is to prune them back like a viticulturalist would prune a vineyard, or an orchardist would prune an apple tree. They don't do it to kill it. They do it to stimulate new, fresh, fresh growth. And so the pruning is what the herbivore did on the prairies in this mechanism. And they did it with three principles. The first one was they were always moving. They were never in the same place. What kept them moving? Well, flies, predators, annual cycles, the monsoons, the rain, the cold and heat, and different things kept them moving. The second thing is they were mobbed up for protection from lions and wolves and jaguars and whatever. And the third one is they were mowing. You know, they weren't eating flesh. They were mowing. Basically, an herbivore is an herbivore, which is of course what a cow is. An herbivore is essentially a portable four-legged sauerkraut vat. Okay, that's it's a fermentation tank. All right, so they have a mower on their front end that ferments it, and then they exhaust a wonderfully concentrated nutrients out their back end. I mean, and so so it's this pruning. And so here's my point: moving, mobbing, and mowing are the pattern, the template of nature. And the problem is when you put these herbivores in a feedlot, or you don't move them around strategically, daily, essentially. If you violate any of these three things, moving, mobbing, and mowing, if you violate any of those three, then all of the blessings of the herbivore invert to liabilities. And, you know, it should give us all pause to realize that 500 years ago, North America had more pounds of animals than it does today, even with factory farming, John Deere tractors, and hybrid corn and chemical fertilizers. So there was more, including the weight of humans. All right. So we put humans into weight, we put all the factory farms into weight, we put all the feedlots into weight, and North America had more pounds of animals 500 years ago than it does today. Now, it wasn't all being eaten by humans. You know, we had a million wolves, each of whom needed 20 pounds of meat a day. So there's 20 million pounds of meat just going to the wolf population. And that's not to mention the coyotes, the foxes, and, you know, everything else, and the Native Americans. So so my point is that that when we're trying to duplicate the mechanism by which nature built soil with this biomass, this perennial biomass that was then constantly pruned and concentrated, that's the way nature built it. When we violate that template, then we have the negatives. And so these movies like Cowspiracy and things like that impugn, that talk about, you know, how terrible cows are, every one of them concentrates on our current system, which violates one, two, and often all three of these principles that I've articulated here. And when your database, here you go, when your database is based on a dysfunctional system, it's going to lead you to some weird conclusions. The weird conclusion being, wow, let's get rid of all the cows. Cows are bad. But no, actually, herbivores are what built our rich soils that we're now mining with corn and soybeans. And they built our rich soil, but they built it through moving, mobbing, and mowing. And today, with electric fence and water pipe and nursery shade cloth, we can now, on our farms, like we do here at Polyface, we can now duplicate the moving, mobbing, mowing choreography of nature's millennial soil building strategy. We can now duplicate that on a commercial domestic farm because we have the infrastructure to be able to do it. And so in half a century on our farm, we have gone from an average of 1% organic matter in the soil to today over 8% organic matter. That's mind-boggling. It's substantial, especially when because it's organic matter that feeds the soil. That's what feeds the biology and the earthworms and the actinomycetes and the myceliums and all that in the soil. And not only that, but every 1% increase of organic matter holds an additional 20,000 pounds of water per acre, because that's the sponge of the soil. It's the porosity of the soil. And so today, we've gone from 1% to 8%, which is 7 percentage increases times 20,000 gallons per acre is 140,000 gallons per acre of water that we can now hold in our soils here, more than we could in 1961 when we came. And that's a pretty cool thing. You know, when you look at droughts and floods and things like that, the porosity, the ability of the soil to sponge water quickly when it comes and hold on to it for a long time when it's not there, that is probably the most critical part of environmental resiliency that we can even imagine.